All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tomas Banya, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about how to leverage some of the information you already have in your respective organizations to find some of the stuff that may be lingering around your environment. Quick introduction of myself. I'm an information security manager at Dolby. I'm responsible for managing the cyber defense and security operations teams for our organization. But before we begin, I'm going to give a quick primer on a few items here. First thing is going to be, what is threat intel? Threat intel in the simplest form is the information that you use to find bad stuff in your environment. I have 6 different types of threat intel listed up there. 3 main ones that we're going to focus on today are domains, IP addresses, and URLs. Hashes, signatures, and signals are really interesting, especially as you go further down that list. But those can have some intricacies behind them. Where can I get threat intel? So I broke this down into 3 categories: open source, public source, and commercial. Open source, there's a lot of lists out there. I've listed 2 main resources you can look at to get the vast majority of them. And even more so, if you look on GitHub and type in awesome anything, you could probably find some really good things on various topics in security. The second category, as I mentioned, is public source. With public source, what I mean by that is it's information that you're going to gather from a closed community but is generally accessible to the public. The first one I've listed there is the US CERT AIS, which is their automated information sharing offering. And what it is, it's a offering provided by the Department of Homeland Security, where the government and the private sector share threat intel. And the second one, some of you may already be familiar with, are various ISACs. So these are organizations that are usually formed from particular business sectors, whether it be entertainment, finance, banking, industrial, and they like to share information together. And the last category here is commercial. I'm sure we know most of these companies already: CrowdStrike, FireEye, Recorded Future. I'm sure we can name about 100 more that are happy to sell you a list. As we go down this list, generally speaking, we'd like to think that the commercial offerings have the highest percentage of validated intel. And for the purposes of this presentation, that's what we'll act upon in the presumption. But first, let's talk about some of the bad ways you can implement threat intelligence in your enterprise. First one being using threat feeds as block lists. In the past 6 months, there's a very large enterprise where a security analyst on a watch floor had a threat intel hit on Microsoft.com. They looked into the alert, and of course, through their investigation, even though Microsoft was tied in there, and there was some malicious activity on the system, they decided it'd be a bright idea to block Microsoft.com for the entire organization. Needless to say, the following 4 hours was basically zero productivity for the entire company because, well, Office 365 runs on it and just about everything else. And the second thing I've listed here is turning on all the feeds on day one. As with just about everything in security, some organizations really want to just get everything done as quickly as possible and hope for the best on the other end. Another organization, slightly smaller, tried that strategy with one of the block lists on the internet. Now, once again, as I mentioned, using threat feeds as block lists is already a bad idea. But they put a block list in their threat feed, or in their threat feed repository, and they were lighting up, I think it was like 1.2 million alerts a minute. Basically, every single event that was going through there was getting flagged as an alert. It brought down their security operation completely, and they had to nuke it and redo their intel list. So, probably not a good thing to do. So the next thing I'm going to focus on here is, why is threat intel so bad? For those of you, well, actually, let me ask this. How many of you use open source threat intel in your organization today? Pretty sizable amount. How many of you have challenges using open source threat intel in your environment today? Also pretty sizable amount. Well, the reality is, it's not actually that bad. There are certainly challenges with it. It can be noisy, but it actually has some hidden gems. And for anyone who's remotely interested in geology, that gem right there is actually called hiddenite, for what it's worth. Well, what can we do to make this threat intel more useful? One of the most common methods is just leverage aggregation triggers. Don't look at it if it's happening once, but if it happens over and over and over again, trigger an alert to your analysts. That's certainly one way of doing it, but what if we can just use the data we already have to conduct this self-enrichment? A few considerations before starting down this journey is you want to understand the capabilities of your existing platforms. First thing being, how much data do you actually have? Every organization has different retention periods on their various data types. If you're holding something for a week or 2 weeks, you're not going to be able to conduct a search for a year. And conversely, if you're holding it for 3 years, you may not want to make a search that lasts that long. Where the data is available. We'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. And the third one is probably the most important one, is search capacity. So in many organizations, when we implement a SIM or we implement a logging platform, we have certain goals that we want to meet. And as the organization evolves, those wants and needs grow, but the hardware capacity may not. So you may run at a point where you're basically running at 80, 90, 95% utilization of your various platforms, and stacking on an additional task like this may not be realistically feasible. Or if you're pushing through 800 gigs an hour, that's another possibility. So where do I start? The first thing is find that threat feed that's providing you high noise and low ROI. I'm not going to name any particular ones. Later in the presentation, I'm going to give a few results from the findings that we've had as an organization. But I'm sure you've got a few in mind that may just be streaming off alerts that are generally not providing much value. Identify the data that you collect that corresponds with the threat feed selected. Network activity, so firewall, IDS, IPS, and I've also added in there EDR logs. Can also be useful. When doing a search across all of these log types, you're going to want to make sure that you're not triggering on duplicate answers or duplicate results in your search. So let's say if you have a computer reaching out to a specific domain or IP address, you don't want to count that as one hit on your IPS, one hit on your firewall, one hit on your EDR agent, so on and so forth. You're going to want to make sure that you have some sort of aggregation in place to accommodate that. And search for existing activity in your environment. How can you do it? I've put up like the 6 options that I could think of that kind of cover the largest scope of use out there. If there's another platform out there that you guys want some help with, I'm more than happy to walk that through after the presentation here. But on the SIM side, you can leverage ArcSight. There's a lot of cool stuff you can actually do using active lists and lightweight rules to accommodate for this kind of threat activity with a low performance hit. On Splunk, leveraging lookup tables and data models, and in Elastic, leveraging Boolean logic. Or there's a few other things you could do as well, but Boolean logic is probably the simplest one to go after. And the second thing I've listed here, if you want to make this a process that's repeatable, is leveraging an automation platform. For those organizations that have ServiceNow and have the orchestration module, you can leverage the guided parsing and search correlation functions within the interface. And then I added Demisto and Phantom on there because both of these platforms both have an enterprise edition as well as a community edition that you could leverage to conduct this activity. The difference between the two platforms is Demisto will do parsing by utility and Phantom will do parsing by an action. More than happy to explain that further later if anyone would like. So first things first, ingest the noisy intel. Once again, choose that source and then import that intel into the analysis platform of choice. Next, you're going to want to compare the noisy intel against the historic, network, or whatever other data you have in place. So once again, this is searching across your organization for matches to the identified intel type. I've listed out here 3 types of organizations, and this is more for presentation, but every organization is unique and different, and you're going to want to set these goalposts to what makes sense for your organization. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to do a 1-year search on 30 days of data. It's just not going to work. So the way I've broken it down here is organization A is representative of an organization that's new to Intel management. Organization B is representative of what a small organization could generally do. And organization C is what I've generally seen in large enterprises when they've pursued these kind of activities. So the next thing I have here is establishing parameters to identify low noise indicators. Once again, these are numbers that you can modify based on what you're seeing in your organization. Some things may be triggering less often, but may still be of higher value to you. And I'm not going to read them off here, but as you can see, the larger the organization or the more mature the organization, generally speaking, you can increase that threshold for exclusion. Now, I do want to clarify one point here, and that is, if you are a larger organization, you already have a content engineer or something going through and pre-parsing your data. Isn't that fairly equivalent to this process? It's a starting point to this process. The whole intent of this is that it's continuous validation. So as you have new intel coming in and coming up on these various lists, the process matures to a point where you can automate it, and it constantly refreshes the intel that is and is not on those respective lists. Compiling the data into a usable threat feed. So at this point, you're going to take that data that you have, and place it back into your alerting platform of choice. And the note that I have here is all that data that you've excluded out, it's not necessarily garbage or something that you need to just throw away. It can be leveraged for something called secondary intel. And the best way I find putting that is if you see this indicator along with one of these other indicators, you can give it a higher priority or a higher confidence score. I find that many organizations look at intel as a one-to-one type scenario, but if you actually combine a series of indicators to provide you a higher confidence scoring in your alerting environment, it helps your analysts and it guides them towards finding resolution faster. What are the other things you can do to drill down on this data? First thing I have listed here is using an IP lookup database. First one is filtering by ASN. Is anyone not familiar with what an ASN is? So an ASN is basically an identifier that's assigned to organizations for IP ranges. And let's say you have an ASN. ASN's assigned to Microsoft, Amazon, Google, so on and so forth. You could take those ASNs, take all the IP addresses from there, and say, those I'm not going to use as a primary indicator. Why? Because we see attackers more and more often leveraging these services that are legitimately used by end users for malicious purposes. Does that mean we want to block Box.com, Microsoft.com, Google.com? Not necessarily. Does it mean we want to alert on it? Probably not. But, once again, we may be able to use these as secondary or tertiary indicators to provide more value to the overall alert. Second one is filtering by country. So, if you have a country that your organization just does not do business with, most commonly, good starting point is the list of U.S. embargoed countries. You're probably not doing business with them, so you probably shouldn't be seeing traffic from there. You can potentially use those as threat intel lists. I would generally not recommend it because there are situations where systems will communicate with those, but you can still leverage those as secondary or tertiary indicators. The second thing I have listed here is matching up intel to known threats. So, not only taking that intel that you have there and looking at it against historical data in your organization, but also looking at what kind of threats were generated by that IP address, and then taking that into consideration when establishing the value of a given indicator. Sorting by known traffic type is something that has come about with next-gen firewalls and some of the newer proxy functionalities. So if you do see a certain type of activity that is categorized by a given platform a certain way, you can once again give it a higher or lower value. And then probably most importantly is factoring in the intel age. This comes down to many of the common sources of compromise are going to be, especially on the domain and domain URL side, are going to be your mom and pop shop's website that got compromised, or some small business that didn't have patching in place and they're being used as the attack source. So generally speaking, when those type of sites get compromised, someone reaches out to them pretty darn soon. And after about a week to 3 weeks, those indicators don't have nearly as much value as they had before. So what I'd recommend as part of this process is not just factoring in what you're seeing in your organization, but see how old the intel is and what others have been seeing as well. One of the things that my organization does with other people in the high-tech manufacturing sector is we compare what our search results are amongst a group, and we have smaller and larger organizations in the ISAC, and because of that, we're able to provide a broader picture than what we'd be able to do on our own. So in terms of drawbacks to this kind of approach is, as with all intel, if you suppress it, the alerts aren't going to come for it. One of the ways that you can remedy this is ensure that your alerting platform will still allow you to trigger on that domain or URL alert just because an IP address is suppressed. I've seen a lot of organizations where they will suppress an IP address, but their alerting platform is configured to say, if any of these conditions are true, suppress it, and then a lot of valuable alerting is just simply lost in those situations. So, as I mentioned, these are some of the implementation results that we've seen in our organization. Overall, reduced threat intel list size and fewer false alerts. With the various SANS list, we've seen roughly a 12% reduction in total indicators. And like I said, because we implement this as a continuous process, all these numbers generally fluctuate, but on average, roughly 12%. A 97% reduction in false positives. And originally we were going to rip out this list completely, or some of these lists completely. Because we didn't, we had 4 incidents that we found that we would not have found using any other traditional means. D-Shield, 5% reduction in total indicators, 65% reduction in false positives, 3 incidents found. And CI Army, 16% reduction in total indicators, 80% reduction in false positives, and 1 incident found. That's all I have for you. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. If not, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.